All right, so on to implication number 6. Logic is autonomous. Logic is autonomous. So this, in some ways, seems like it conflicts with number 5, which was logic is a social discipline. So, but he's going to be talking about something different in this context. So it's not that logic is separate from society, but that it's separate from other things, or it precludes other things. So let's take a look at this. So he writes, the position taken, Dewey's position, the position taken implies the ultimacy of inquiry in determination of the formal conditions of inquiry. So ultimately, inquiry determines the formal conditions of inquiry. Logic, which is the formal conditions of inquiry, logic as inquiry into inquiry is, if you please, a circular process. It does not depend on anything extraneous to inquiry. And we've seen that circular process come up many times where logic comes out of inquiry and then goes back into inquiry. And kind of a circular but also progressive process. The force of this proposition may perhaps be most readily understood by noting what it precludes. So what it makes not possible. This idea of logic as circular, as not dependent on anything outside of inquiry. So what does that preclude? So he says, it precludes the determination and selection of logical first principles by an a priori intuitional act, even when the intuition in question is said to be that of intellectus purus, or pure intellect. So he's mentioned this point before. Logical principles are not something that comes out of just pure intuition, pure intellect. Logical principles come out of inquiry. So going on, it precludes resting logic upon metaphysical and epistemological assumptions and presuppositions. So we don't need metaphysics or epistemology to have logic. The latter, metaphysical and epistemological assumptions, these are to be determined, if at all, by means of what is disclosed as the outcome of inquiry. So, in fact, metaphysics and epistemology are determined, if we need to determine them at all, they're determined by what happens through inquiry. They're determined by inquiry rather than the reverse. You don't first get your metaphysics and your epistemology and then have inquiry. If anything, it's the reverse. So metaphysics and epistemology, are not to be shoved under inquiry as its foundation, right? So this is another sense of the meaning autonomous. It doesn't need a foundation from another field like metaphysics and epistemology. So going on the epistemological side, it precludes, as was noted earlier in another connection, the assumption of a prior, ready-made definition of knowledge, which determines the character of inquiry. Knowledge is to be defined in terms of inquiry, not vice versa, both in particular and universally. So we don't need to decide first what knowledge is and then figure out if our inquiry is leading to knowledge. Successful inquiry leads to knowledge. That decides what knowledge is. Inquiry that works and promotes more successful inquiry is knowledge-giving inquiry. So you don't have criteria of knowledge set up beforehand. At least extraneously, right? They're set up by previous inquiry. Not extraneously to inquiry. Next paragraph. The autonomy of logic also precludes the idea that its foundations are psychological. So it's not metaphysical, not epistemological, also not psychological in terms of its foundations. It is not necessary to reach conclusions about sensations, sense data, ideas, and thought, or mental faculties generally, as material that preconditions logic. This is kind of the same point, but just in terms of psychology rather than epistemology, just as we don't need to predefine knowledge as a precondition for doing inquiry. We also don't need to have definite conclusions about what are sensations or thoughts and so on, and those kinds of terms. On the contrary, he says, on the contrary, just as the specific meaning of these matters is determined in specific inquiries, so generally their relation to the logic of inquiry is determined by discovering the relation that the subject matters to which these names are given bear to the effective conduct of inquiry as such. So all these psychological terms have pragmatic use within inquiry. So the meaning of them is determined by specific inquiries. Right? It's a very long sentence. So second part of the sentence again. So generally their relation to the logic of inquiry is determined by discovering the relations that the subject matters to which these names are given bear to effective conduct of inquiry. Yeah, so the relation of psychological terms to inquiry is determined by their the relation that the subject matters to which these names are given bear to the effective conduct of inquiry as such. So what do those terms point to, and how is that related to the conduct of inquiry? So psychology is very important to the study of inquiry, as we'll find out. But it's not something that preconditions, as he says, inquiry. It's more, as with epistemology, it's more something coming out of inquiry as part of the process of doing a successful inquiry. The point, here we go. So the point may be illustrated by reference to thought. It would have been possible in the preceding pages to use the term reflective thought where the word inquiry has been used. But if that word had been used, it is certain that some readers would have supposed that reflective thought designated something already sufficiently known, so that inquiry was equated to a pre-existing definition of thought. So reflective thought, kind of another way of stating inquiry, of defining inquiry. We're talking about inquiry, but that might create a confusion because you might think reflective thought comes first, right? A pre-existing definition of thought, and being used to define inquiry rather than just that's what inquiry is. The opposite view is implied in the position taken by Dewey's position. We do not know what meaning is to be assigned to reflective thought except in terms of what is discovered by inquiry into inquiry. So we discover the meaning of reflective thought in other psychological terms. At least we do not know what it means for the purposes of logic, except through inquiry into inquiry. Personally, he says, I doubt whether there exists anything that may be called thought as a strictly psychical existence. But it is not necessary to go into that question here, for even if there be such a thing, it does not determine the meaning of thought for logic. Yeah, so what would thought as a strictly psychical existence be? Well, we can speculate about that, but it doesn't really matter for the purposes of understanding logic, of an inquiry into inquiry. So next paragraph, he says, either the word thought has no business at all in logic, or else it is a synonym of inquiry, and its meaning is determined by what we find out about inquiry. The latter would seem to be the reasonable alternative. So defining thought is basically defining inquiry, what we find out about inquiry. These statements do not mean that a sound psychology may not be of decided advantage to logical theory, for history demonstrates that unsound psychology has done great damage, but its general relation to logic is found in the light that it, as a branch of inquiry, may throw upon what is involved in inquiry. So the general relation of psychology to logic is found in the light that psychology as a branch of inquiry can throw upon what is involved in inquiry. So psychology is itself a form of inquiry, right? Psychological science. And so the general relation of psychology to logic is in its existence as one form of inquiry that we can learn from and learn what inquiry is from. So its generic relation to logic is similar to that of physics or biology. So physics, biology, other forms of inquiry that can tell us about inquiry. Specifically, for reasons that will appear in subsequent chapters, its findings stand closer to logical theory than do those of other sciences. So psychology does have a closer connection to logical theory, I think because psychology is more closely related to kind of everyday behavior, the study of everyday behavior, and inquiry is a form of behavior. So there are certain reasons why psychology might be closer to logical theory than, say, physics or biology, strictly speaking. And then he writes, occasional reference to psychological subject matter is inevitable in any case, for as will be shown later, some logical positions that pride themselves upon their complete indifference to psychological considerations, in fact, rest upon psychological notions that have become so current, so embedded in intellectual tradition, that they are accepted uncritically as if they were self-evident. So psychology is important. There's some important reasons to kind of get psychology right, to kind of figure out psychology, because other logics rest upon maybe bad psychological notions or problematic psychological notions. So we do want to be able to say something about psychology as well, because it is close to science and it influences how logicians have thought about logic. So last paragraph here. The remaining chapters of Part 1 are preparatory to the later and more detailed outline of what is implied in the propositions 1. That logical theory is the systematic formulation of controlled inquiry, and 2. That logical forms accrue in and because of control that yields conclusions which are warrantably assertable. So these are two major points. Logical theory, logical forms are systematic formulations of controlled inquiry, of what guides successful inquiry, and logical forms accrue in and because of control. That yields conclusions which are warrantably assertable, that we have good reasons for asserting. Were the general point of view even moderately represented in current theory, these chapters would not be needed. Yeah, so except for the kind of bad logical ideas in currency, we wouldn't need to go into all of this. But these are actually really interesting chapters, these next chapters. In the present state of logical discussion, they seem to me to be necessary. Chapters 2 and 3 consider the naturalistic background of the theory, one upon its biological side, the other upon the cultural. Chapters 4 and 5 endeavor to state the need and importance of a revision of logical theory in the direction that has been set forth. So we'll begin next time with the second chapter of Part 1, which you can kind of see here as the existential matrix of inquiry, biological. Right, chapters 2 and 3, we're going to be talking about biology and culture as a background for inquiry or a theory of logic. So again, theory is not autonomous in the sense of being distinct from the rest of life, the rest of the world. It's grounded in biology, it's grounded in culture, it's grounded in human life. But it's autonomous in the sense that you don't need a priori theories of metaphysics or epistemology or psychology in order to found it. Those things come out of inquiry into inquiry, which again is, you could maybe think that of inquiry being grounded in life, in the living process. All right. But that's the end of the very first introductory chapter. And next time we'll take up chapter 2.